It began in the most ordinary way, the kind of moment you wouldn't expect to stay with you. I was leaning against the counter in my friend's kitchen, idly sipping a glass of water, when his mom walked in. She was wearing a light blouse, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair loosely tied back as though she'd been busy with a dozen things that morning. She had that air about her, the graceful kind of confidence that comes from someone who has long stopped trying to impress anyone, and yet somehow impresses you even more for it. I don't even remember what set me off, maybe something about the way she sighed after bending down to get something from the oven. I laughed and teased, "Careful, you're going to make yourself sound old." The words hung in the air for half a second, and I immediately regretted them, but instead of frowning, she turned toward me with a mock gasp. Her eyes lit up, sparkling with that mix of amusement and challenge, and then she laughed. Not a polite little laugh, but a real one, warm, rich, and completely disarming. "Oh, old, am I?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "You're brave for someone who still depends on me to feed him when he's here." I chuckled awkwardly, but there was something in her tone, the playful sharpness of it, that made my chest tighten. Then, tilting her head slightly, she added, "I'll show you young again." She said it with a grin, brushing past me to set a dish on the counter. But the words landed differently than a joke should have. Maybe it was the way her sleeve brushed my arm as she passed, soft fabric against my skin, leaving behind a faint trace of her perfume, subtle, floral, but grounded with something warmer. Or maybe it was just the look in her eyes, daring me to say something back. I didn't. Instead, I laughed and tried to play it off, but inside I felt a sudden shift. For the first time, I was acutely aware of her, not just as my friend's mom, not just as the woman who had known me since I was a kid, but as someone with a presence that pulled at me in a way I couldn't quite explain. As she moved around the kitchen, I caught myself watching the small details, the curve of her wrist as she stirred something, the easy rhythm in the way she carried herself. She wasn't rushing, wasn't trying too hard. And yet, somehow, every movement drew my attention. When she glanced back at me, just briefly, I could swear she caught me staring. Her lips curved into a smile that looked like she knew exactly what I was thinking, even though I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. And just like that, something had changed. What started as a careless tease had opened a door I hadn't expected to even exist. Dinner that evening felt different, though nothing outwardly unusual was happening. The table was filled with the usual noise, my friend talking animatedly about his classes, his mom moving back and forth from the stove, setting dishes down with the practiced ease of someone who's done it all her life. And yet, I couldn't stop noticing her. I told myself I was imagining things. That her laughter earlier, her playful jab about showing me young again, was just her way of brushing off a silly remark. But now, sitting across from her, I found myself too aware of every glance, every gesture. She poured water into my glass, the faint clink of ice against the rim sounding louder than it should have. Her fingers lingered just a second longer than necessary on the edge of the glass before she set the pitcher down. When I looked up to thank her, her eyes met mine, not accidentally, but directly. And though she broke away quickly, the moment had already stretched long enough to leave me wondering if she felt it too. The conversation around me carried on, but my attention drifted. I noticed how she leaned her chin against her hand when she listened, her elbow propped gently on the table, the faintest crease forming between her brows when she was focused. When she smiled, it wasn't just her mouth that changed. Her whole face softened, her eyes warming in a way that made the room feel less ordinary. At one point, my hand rested on the table near hers. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that the air between us felt charged. She reached for the salt, her sleeve brushing against my knuckles, and for a fleeting second, I felt the warmth of her skin beneath the fabric. It was nothing, and yet everything. My pulse quickened, my chest tightened. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself of where I was, of who she was. But every time I dared glance at her, I found her eyes already lifting toward mine, as though we were caught in the same silent rhythm. Each time, she looked away first, with a quick smile, like she was pretending not to notice. My friend, oblivious to it all, carried the weight of the conversation, filling the space with his stories. I laughed when he expected me to, answered when he paused for my input, but I wasn't really there. I was somewhere else entirely, caught in the quiet gravity of his mother's presence. By the time dinner ended, I felt both restless and strangely reluctant to leave the table. There was no touch, no words beyond the casual ones we'd exchanged, and yet, the silence between our glances said more than I was ready to admit. It was in those small, stolen looks that I realized something had shifted. The joke earlier hadn't faded away. It was alive, pulsing quietly beneath the surface of every moment we shared later that evening. When the house had settled into its quiet rhythm, I found myself lingering in the living room. The lights were dim, the only glow coming from the muted lamp in the corner. My friend had disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts when I heard her footsteps. Soft, measured, almost hesitant. She stepped into the room carrying a mug of tea, her hair now loose around her shoulders, falling in natural waves that framed her face. Without makeup, without the lively energy of earlier, she seemed different, softer, almost vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice low, warm. I smiled faintly and shook my head. "Not really. You?" She gave a small laugh, sitting down on the couch beside me. Not too close, but close enough that I could feel the cushion dip, the faint warmth of her presence brushing against me. "Sleep and I, we don't always get along," she admitted. She looked down into her tea, swirling it slowly. "Getting older does that to you, I guess." Her words caught me. The lightness in her tone couldn't hide the undercurrent beneath it, a touch of self-consciousness, a flicker of something unguarded. I shifted slightly, turning toward her. "You say that like it's a bad thing," I murmured. "Honestly, you don't seem older. You seem steady, like you've figured things out the rest of us are still stumbling through." She glanced up, startled by the sincerity in my voice. For a moment, she didn't speak, just studied me, her eyes searching, as though weighing whether to believe me. Then she smiled, small and genuine. "That's a kind way to put it." Silence fell, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The kind of silence where the air itself seems to thrum with something unspoken. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her hand trembling just slightly, and for reasons I couldn't explain, that tiny tremor moved me more than anything else had that day. "I worry sometimes," she said quietly, almost as if she wasn't speaking to me at all. "That life is passing quicker than I thought it would. That people only see the years, not the person underneath." I didn't think. I just reached out, my hand resting gently on her forearm. The fabric of her sleeve was soft beneath my palm, but it was the warmth of her skin underneath that made my chest ache. "I see you," I said simply. Her eyes flicked down to my hand, then back to my face. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a slow breath, the corners of her lips curving upward, not in laughter this time, but in something quieter. Something grateful. She touched my arm in return, her fingertips brushing lightly against my sleeve, a touch so subtle it might have been accidental. But I felt it, every bit of it, as if the room itself had grown smaller, as if we were the only two people in the world. For the first time that night, I realized just how dangerous, and how irresistible, this connection was becoming. The next afternoon, the house was quieter than usual. My friend had gone out to meet someone, leaving me behind. I wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the faint hum of music coming from a small speaker on the counter. She was there, back turned to me, humming softly as she stirred something in a pot. Sunlight spilled through the window, catching the strands of her hair and giving them a warm, golden glow. She looked over her shoulder when she noticed me, her lips curving into that familiar half-smile. "Well, if it isn't the brave young man who thinks I'm old," she teased, her voice playful, though her eyes carried that glimmer I'd begun to recognize, the one that made my chest tighten. I raised my hands in surrender. Guilty, but I'm starting to regret it. Her laugh was quiet but rich, and then, with a spark of mischief, she set the spoon down and wiped her hands on a towel. She gestured toward me with a little tilt of her chin. "You said I sounded old, so let me show you how young I still am." Before I could ask what she meant, she reached for my hand. Her fingers slipped around mine with surprising confidence, warm and steady. "Come on," she said, tugging me gently toward the open space in the kitchen. I followed, my pulse quickening. The music was faint, just a mellow tune drifting through the room, but she began to sway, pulling me with her. At first, I laughed nervously, my steps clumsy compared to the easy rhythm of her body. But she didn't let go. She guided me with a soft pressure of her hand, her palm resting against mine, her other hand brushing briefly against my shoulder before settling there with the kind of natural ease that made my breath catch. "You're stiff," she teased, looking up at me with a grin. "Relax. It's just dancing." "Just dancing," I echoed, though it didn't feel like just anything. Her laughter filled the room, light and unforced. I couldn't help but notice how alive she seemed in that moment, her movements graceful but playful, her hair shifting against her cheek as she spun lightly and then came back toward me. When she did, her body brushed against mine, the briefest contact, but enough to send a shiver racing down my spine. I held her a little closer without meaning to, my hand steadying at the curve of her waist. She didn't pull away. Instead, she met my eyes, her expression softer now, the teasing giving way to something quieter. For a few heartbeats, the music faded into the background. It was just her and me, the rhythm of our steps, the warmth of her hand in mine. When the song ended, she lingered there, her palms still resting against my chest, her breathing faintly uneven. Then, with a playful smirk, she whispered, "Still think I'm old?" I shook my head, my voice low, almost unsteady. Not for a second. Her smile deepened, but she stepped back then, letting her hand slip away. The air between us buzzed with something unspoken, something dangerous, and yet, neither of us moved to break it completely. The game had changed. What began as laughter and teasing had turned into something I could no longer pretend was harmless. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the guest bed, staring at the ceiling while the soft tick of the clock filled the silence. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the way she had laughed in the kitchen, the warmth of her hand in mine, the gentle press of her palm against my chest when the dance had ended. It was nothing. That's what I kept telling myself. Just a joke carried too far. A playful moment with my friend's mom, nothing more. But my heart refused to listen. I could still feel the ghost of her touch lingering on my skin, as real as if she were still there. The guilt crept in next. She was older. She was my friend's mother. There were unspoken rules here, boundaries that weren't meant to be crossed. And yet, the memory of her laugh, of her eyes holding mine, didn't feel wrong. It felt alive, like something rare and impossible had been handed to me, something I wasn't sure I had the right to hold. The house was quiet, everyone asleep. Or at least, I thought so. Then I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside my door. My breath caught, my body tensing as if the silence itself had grown heavy. For a long moment, nothing happened. No knock, no voice. Just the pause, long enough to make me wonder if she was standing there, hesitating the same way I was. And then, the sound of her steps moving away. Down the hall, fading into nothing. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, but it left me restless, torn between relief and disappointment. If she had knocked, if she had opened that door, what would I have done? Would I have stopped her? Or would I have given in to the gravity that seemed to be pulling us together more with each passing moment? I turned onto my side, pressing my palm against my chest where her hand had rested earlier. My heartbeat thudded against it, uneven, impatient. I wanted to see her again, wanted to hear that laugh, to feel the way her presence changed the room. But I also knew the risk. This wasn't some casual attraction that could be brushed aside. This was deeper, stronger, dangerous. I lay awake for hours, caught between longing and restraint. Every whisper of wind outside, every creak of the house felt louder than it should have. My body begged for sleep, but my mind replayed every glance, every touch. When morning finally came, I felt heavy-eyed, but the sight of her in the kitchen, calm, radiant in the pale morning light, stole the breath from my lungs all over again. And in that moment, I realized something frightening. I wasn't just drawn to her. I was already in too deep. The following day, she asked me if I could help carry in the groceries. It seemed like nothing, a simple task, one I'd done plenty of times before. But the moment I stepped outside and saw her standing by the car, the sun catching her hair, a soft smile tugging at her lips, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. We worked side by side, our movements easy, almost practiced. She handed me bags, our fingers brushing in those brief exchanges, each touch sending a ripple through me that I tried to ignore. The silence between us was filled with the sound of rustling paper, the thud of bags set on the counter. And yet, beneath it all, something unspoken hummed steadily, as if we were both aware of the thin line we were walking. It happened so quickly, and yet in my memory it stretches out like slow motion. She was stepping up the small porch stairs, her arms full, when her foot caught on the edge. She stumbled, just slightly, and before I could think, I dropped the bag I was holding and reached out. My hands found her waist, firm but careful, steadying her before she could fall. Her body pressed against mine for a heartbeat, maybe two. I felt the warmth of her through the thin fabric of her blouse, the subtle curve of her form beneath my hands. She let out a startled breath, her cheek brushing lightly against my chest as she regained her balance. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, her closeness, the scent of her hair, the sound of her breathing. When she lifted her face to look at me, we were too close. Her eyes searched mine, wide and unguarded, as though she wasn't sure what she was supposed to do next. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. My hands lingered at her waist, not gripping, just resting, unwilling to let go too soon. And though I told myself to step back, to break the moment before it could become too much, I didn't. I couldn't. Her lips parted slightly, as if she might say something, but the words never came. Instead, the silence deepened, thick with everything we weren't saying. I felt my heartbeat hammering against my ribs, sure she could hear it. Her hand lifted, just barely, fingertips brushing against my chest as though testing how close she could come before it was too far. It was a breath away from something irreversible. A confession without words, a pull neither of us wanted to resist. And then, as if the world remembered itself, a car door slammed in the distance, a neighbor, breaking the spell. She drew back quickly, smoothing her blouse with trembling hands, her composure returning like a mask sliding back into place. "Thank you," she said softly, almost too softly, before turning back toward the kitchen. I stood there for a moment longer, my palms still tingling with the memory of her. We hadn't kissed. We hadn't spoken a single forbidden word. But everything between us had changed. That evening, the air outside was calm, touched by the fading warmth of the sun. The sky stretched wide in shades of orange and lavender, the kind of sunset that asks you to sit still and let it linger. I stepped out onto the porch, unsure if I was looking for her, but somehow knowing she would be there. She sat on the wooden steps, a mug of tea cradled between her hands. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a heaviness in her shoulders, as though she carried the weight of something unsaid. When she turned and saw me, she smiled faintly, almost shyly, and patted the space beside her. I lowered myself onto the step, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her, not so close that it crossed a line. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The cicadas hummed in the trees, the boards creaked under our weight, and the world seemed suspended in that quiet hour before night fully arrives. Finally, she broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, eyes still fixed on the horizon, "people spend so much time talking about age, about what you're supposed to have figured out by now, or what you're supposed to let go of. Sometimes I think it's just noise, all those expectations." Her voice carried a note of vulnerability I hadn't heard before. I turned toward her, studying the curve of her profile in the fading light, the way her lashes caught the glow of the sunset. "Maybe," I said carefully, "but it doesn't change the fact that you don't feel old. Not to me." She glanced at me then, searching my face, as though she needed to measure the honesty in my words. Whatever she found there made her smile, small, tender, tinged with something fragile. "And you," she murmured, "make me forget for a little while. Make me feel lighter." The confession hung between us, delicate and undeniable. My heart thudded, but I didn't push further. Instead, I let the silence speak for us. Slowly, almost hesitantly, I let my hand drift closer to hers on the step. Our fingers brushed, light as a whisper, and then, with a quiet certainty, she turned her hand, letting our fingers lace together. The touch was simple, but it felt like everything. Her skin was warm, her grip gentle yet sure, as though she wanted me to know she was choosing this moment, choosing me, even if we couldn't name what it meant. We sat that way as the sun dipped below the horizon, our joined hands resting between us, steady and unashamed. No grand declarations, no promises of forever. Just the quiet honesty of being seen, being wanted, exactly as we were. When she leaned her head lightly against my shoulder, I felt her breath steady, her presence grounding me in a way I'd never known. And in that stillness, I realized we didn't need words. The bond between us was already written, not loud, not rushed, but real. Whatever tomorrow brought, this moment was ours.